Hello and welcome back. I am going to be reading The Twits. It's a bit of a classic. It's one of my favourites from when I was much younger. I can remember this being read on something called Jack and Ori, which was like a sort of CBeebies bedtime hour for those of you who are far too young to remember. But this was a brilliant, brilliant story. So I'm going to read this to you today in chapters. We won't get all the way through it, so we'll just see how we do. All right, let's see how we get on. The start of this book is great because it has the pictures of the characters. So we've got Mr. Twit, we've got Mrs. Twit, we've got the roly-poly bird, who's a really key character in this, and we've got the Muggle-Wump monkeys. Sorry, forgot, can't read backwards. Muggle-Wump monkeys. They're key characters in this story, and you will get your brains around what they do as we go. So, I'm going to read a few chapters, and then I'll pause, and I'll come back to this tomorrow, all right? And we'll build it up like an exciting episode. So the first one is called, the first chapter, is called Hairy Faces, which is why I had a bit of a shave, because then it's not about me. So, what a lot of hairy-faced men there are around nowadays. And when a man grows hair all over his face, it is impossible to tell what he really looks like. Perhaps that's why he does it. He'd rather you didn't know. And then there's the problem of washing. When the very hairy ones wash their faces, it must be as big a job as when you and I wash the hair on our heads. So what I want to know is this. How often do all these hairy-faced men wash their faces? Is it only once a week, like us, on Sunday nights? And do they shampoo it? Do they use a hairdryer? Do they rub hair tonic in to stop their faces from going bald? Do they go to a barber to have their hairy faces cut and trimmed, or do they do it themselves in front of the bathroom mirror with nail scissors? I don't know. Because next time you see a man with a hairy face, which will probably be as soon as you step out onto the street, maybe you will look at him more closely and start wondering about some of these things. Chapter 2. Mr. Twit. Good beard on him. I've never had a beard that big. Maybe one day. Mr. Twit was one of these very hairy-faced men. The whole of his face, except for his forehead and his eyes and his nose, was covered in thick hair. The stuff even sprouted in revolting tufts out of his nostrils and his ear holes. And Mr. Twit felt that the hairiness made him look terrifically wise and grand. But in truth, he was neither of these things. Mr. Twit was a twit. He was born a twit, and now at the age of 60, he was a bigger twit than ever. The hair on Mr. Twit's face didn't grow smooth and matted as it does on most hairy men's faces. It grew in spikes that stuck out straight like the bristles of a nail brush. And how often did Mr. Twit wash his bristly nail brushy face of his? The answer is never. Not even on Sundays. He hadn't washed it for years. The next chapter is called Dirty Beards. As you know, an ordinary unhairy face like yours or mine simply gets a bit smudgy if it's not washed often enough, and there's nothing so awful about that. But a hairy face is a different matter. Things cling to hairs, especially food. Things like gravy go right in among the hairs and stay there. And you and I can wipe our smooth faces with a flannel or a cloth, and we can quickly look more or less right again. But the hairy man can't do that. We can also, if we are careful, eat our meals without spreading food all over our faces. Although some of you lot struggle, I've seen in the canteen. But not so the hairy man. Watch carefully the next time you see a hairy man eating his lunch, and you will notice that even if he opens his mouth very wide, it is impossible for him to get a spoonful of beef stew or ice cream and chocolate sauce into it without leaving some of it on the hairs. Mr. Twit didn't even bother to open his mouth wide when he ate, and as a result, and because he never washed, there was always hundreds of bits of old breakfasts and lunches and suppers sticking to the hairs around his face. They weren't big bits, mind you, because you had to wipe those off with the back of your hand or his sleeve while he was eating. But if you look closely, not that you'd ever want to, you would see tiny specks of dried up scrambled eggs stuck to the hairs, and spinach and tomato ketchup, and fish fingers and minced chicken livers, and all the other disgusting things that Mr. Twit liked to eat. There's a couple of pictures here that I'm going to show you, just because they're great. First one is Mr. Twit eating, pretty much with his hands. There we are. And then the top one there, look. All his beard with all the bits stuck in. And if you look closer still, and hold your noses, ladies and gentlemen, if you peer deep into the moustachy bristles sticking out over his upper lip, you'd probably see much larger objects that had escaped the wipe of his hands, things that had been there for months and months, like a piece of maggoty green cheese, or a mouldy old cornflake, or even the slimy tail of a tinned sardine. Because of all this, Mr. Twit never really went hungry. By sticking out his tongue and curling it sideways to explore the hairy jungle around his mouth, he was always able to find a tasty morsel here and there to nibble on. What I am trying to tell you is that Mr. Twit was a foul and smelly old man. He was also an extremely horrid old man, as you will find out in a moment. This chapter is called Mrs. Twit, and I'll hold that up nice and close. You can see she's a beauty. Well, maybe not. But actually, there's a bit of an explanation about that as we go. So, quickly do Mrs. Twit. Mrs. Twit was no better than her husband. She did not, of course, have a hairy face. It was a pity she didn't, because that, at any rate, would have hidden some of her fearful ugliness. Take a look at her. Have you ever seen a woman with an uglier face than that? I doubt it. But the funny thing is that Mrs. Twit wasn't born ugly. She had quite a nice face when she was young. The ugliness had grown upon her year by year as she'd got older. Why would that happen? I'll tell you why. If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on the face. And when that person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier until it gets so ugly that you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts cannot ever be ugly. You can have a wonky nose and a crooked mouth and a double chin and stick out teeth. But if you have good thoughts, they will shine out of your face like sunbeams, and you will always look lovely. Lovely. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Lovely. Nothing shone out of Mrs. Twit's face. In her right hand she carried a walking stick, and she used to tell people that this was because she had warts growing on the sole of her left foot, and walking was painful. But the real reason she carried a stick was that she could hit things with it. Things like dogs and cats and small children. And then there was the glass eye. Mrs. Twit had a glass eye that was always looking the other way. That is the next chapter, and I'm going to pause it there. You'll have to wait. I hope you've enjoyed it. We'll see you soon. Take good care of each other. Bye-bye.